Southwest Fire Academy was established in 2015 as a response to the recognized need for quality, safe, and affordable fire and rescue training in Ontario. This is not your average fire college. SFA has high standards for their students, and it is their mission to teach and produce qualified, ambitious firefighters who are prepared to work hard to serve their communities. This is not a diploma mill. This is where you can learn strategic, aggressive firefighting from passionate, intelligent instructors who never forget why they were made to do this job. SFA is an accredited private career college that is regulated by the Ministry of Training, colleges, and universities, with a memorandum of understanding with the Office of the Fire Marshal. This means that SFA is an approved training provider with the OFM, and the programs are recognized in Ontario. Check out their pre-service and expanding selection of course offerings at southwestfireacademy.ca. Hello everyone. Welcome to episode 88 of Multiple Calls. I'm Scott Hewlett. How much ownership and responsibility are you willing to take for your profession, for what you professed? How much honest, constructive, and supportive self-awareness can you garner to break each skill's path and yourself down to the simplest parts and build and rebuild into what is required? And whom and what will you seek out once you seek in to guide you? Who can you become through the growth experience of the fire service? Is this your core desire over acceptance and recognition? What is your engine zero? Here's Adam Maiers.
Kick off with telling me where you grew up and the structure of your family.
I was born and raised in Casper, Wyoming. I lived in Wyoming all the way through college. And then once I graduated, I moved down to Colorado for some work. And we can go into that a little bit later. But happily married, have 3 kids of varying ages. I think my youngest is 7 now, and my oldest is 13. And then one is 11. So yeah, we're busy chasing them around in all sorts of sports activities. So
what did your folks do growing up?
They're both retired now. My dad worked for the phone company for 40 some odd years. Started out with Ma Bell back in Ohio, and then moved out to Wyoming a few years later and started working out here. I think kind of as I think he moved out here as a lineman and then worked his way up in the business. So ended up as a manager when he retired. That classic old school, you stay with one company and work your way up, and at some point you end up in some sort of management position before you retire. So
it seems to be changing even in the fire service now.
Oh dude, it's crazy. Yeah, it's absolutely crazy.
Jumping departments and
yeah, the jumping of departments is crazy, but it's not that it's bad. It just
is what it is. I feel like we were the last holdout for jobs that you would do a full career of.
Right. Yeah. Well, I can't really say anything. I jumped jobs. So that was for other reasons other than the state of the department. So
what was school like when you grew up?
School was school, right? I think any of that stuff through high school is just, I guess, learning how to adapt to the structure, right? I was never really big on the structure of it, but I've always enjoyed learning. So I was really good at, I think, math and sciences. I was horrible at English or literature and stuff like that, which is the exact opposite of my brother. He was really good at that stuff and math and science. So he's the brains. I'm just the guy following in his shadow. So.
And what about sports and hobbies? You said your kids are active. Were you?
I don't even know how my dad got us into hockey or why, because he's really into football and basketball and stuff like that. I think it was just an opportunity at a different sport, and it was kind of in its infancy of growth when we were of the age. I mean, we started playing hockey when I was all they had was a barn, some makeshift boards, and some chicken wire, and would flood it. And so it was funny. Just yesterday, my kids found a bunch of our old hockey photos from when we started out. It's just funny to look back. It's and think about those days in the barn, and now we got a nice hockey rink and everything's good. But yeah, so I started out playing hockey, did some skiing as well whenever I could, but hockey trumped pretty much everything. It wasn't until I guess I got a little bit older that skiing kind of happened a lot more, or I had more time to do it. And then Once I was out of college, climbing, I started climbing quite a bit. When I left Wyoming to go down to Colorado, and like I was saying earlier, I took a job for the Schwinn mountain bike company, working with their race team. I was the technical coordinator for their race team. I traveled around the US and Canada to all sorts of mountain bike races, setting up stuff for Schwinn and helping the team get their stuff done.
You had a couple other unique jobs before the fire service too.
There was no shortage of unique jobs. I think my dad, like, just, I don't know if he wanted us to just have like a good background and stuff, but like being in Wyoming, right? Like there's a lot of ranching that goes on in Wyoming. So my brother, one of his best friends, their family owned a sheep ranch. So I think when I was like, I don't know, 13 or younger, like I was out helping them dock sheep. So like, yeah, just like weird stuff like that. And then my legitimate first job I actually got paid for was logging. And that's because we own some property here in Wyoming and we were building a cabin on it. And so the guy that was building the cabin did logging in the same area. And so in talking to my dad's like, oh, well, I've got these two boys, like they could use some hard labor to make them in. So next thing you know, I got volunteered to go work for him before I think it's actually legal to work as a young kid in the United States. So
In logging, yeah.
yeah, and logging, yeah, like, you know, one of the safest activities, right? Like most people go to work at Taco Bell or something like that, and you know, my dad sent me off to go logging.
Is that what led into the building of furniture?
Let's see, I think the first year I was logging, I basically just did the swamping portion of it. So like the loggers would cut down the trees, limb them and all that, and I would take all the limbs and get them out of the way so that they could get the logs out. And then after that, the next summer, I was able to actually cut down the trees and probably do it legally. And so the next few summers, that's what me and my brother ended up doing, as well as getting the logs out and everything. There's something about wood, right? And like working with wood, you can kind of let your creativity out and do stuff like that. So when I was in college, my brother actually was the first one that was out there building log furniture, and it paid really well. I was just working at a ski and bike shop in town, needed more money because I finally got off my parents' money drip. And so I was like, dang, I need to make some money. Yeah, he got me a job out there, and it started out just peeling logs for furniture. And then it's that classic like business model of like we bring people in at a low level and then we build them up to like help out in upper levels. And so, yeah, by the end of it, building beds and all sorts of different furniture. So yeah, it was fun.
How did environmental geology get into the mix?
One of my best friends growing up, his dad was a geologist. Whenever we would go on trips with his family, he would explain the geology. And then we did a lot of driving for hockey because there wasn't really a whole lot of ice rinks in the state of Wyoming. So we played in Colorado in their league. And so we would always drive down to Colorado. And when you're driving through Wyoming, there's nothing but time and space to kind of look out the window. And so I would look at the mountains and try to figure out like, dude, how is this, like, how did this happen? Right. Because some of them are just absolutely stunning, vivid reds to like these great tans to whites to all sorts of blacks and grays. So, and then like just the formations themselves. And so like, I always wondered how all that happened. And so when I went to college, I was like, shit, I don't really know what I want to do. And I was like, I really like geology. So I like being outside. It just kind of fit. So with that degree, when I finally left Schwinn, because they got bought out by a company in China and they moved from Boulder, Colorado to, was it somewhere in Ohio? I was like, yeah, I'm not going to Ohio. I told myself I would never live on the other side of I-25, which is a major interstate that runs north-south that kind of divides the Rocky Mountains from the plains. And I was like, I don't ever see myself living on the eastern side of that. And so I left there and I was like, well, I've got this geology degree. I spent all this time quenching my thirst for knowledge on how the earth works. Like I might as well put it to work. And so somehow, I don't even know how, I had no experience or all I had was a geology degree and somehow landed a environmental geology job working for a company. It started out with like groundwater cleanup from like old either government entities or military bases, like with the water problems that they had. just going out and testing them and then figuring out how to get all that stuff out of there. It turned into, there was a side of it that did geophysics, like shallow geophysics, looking for unexploded ordnance. I always thought that was interesting because like the places that they went to were really, really cool. I ended up on an island out in the Aleutian chain called ADAC that used to be an old military base that they decommissioned. So part of it was a base, part of it was like a target range. The people that took over the island, the Aleutians that are native there, wanted their island back. So when the government got rid of the base, they're like, well, shoot, we got to clean up all this unexploded ordnance that we shot all over the place or bombed onto it. So I spent a couple of summers up there looking for bombs and bullets. And then that led to some bases here in the mainland. I was up in Seattle for a while doing that. And then kind of Texas, I think was another one. And then South Dakota. Yeah, just kind of all over. Went and looked for bombs over on the East Coast. And I realized, the East Coast is pretty, but man, I don't ever want to live there. There's too many people.
So how did you veer off into the fire service then? That seems like a path you would have just sort of stayed on. Seemed pretty stable.
If you can imagine from what I just explained for the job that I had in that environmental / geology world, I spent a lot of time living out of a backpack, kind of all over the place. And I was just kind of tired of traveling. One of the times when I was back, I met up with, was really into climbing at the time. So one of my friends back here in Casper, he's a big time climber. He was like, hey, let's go climbing. It's like, all right, cool, man. I got nothing going on. So we went just north of Casper to a place to go climbing. And in the process of going there, I'd known that he was like volunteering for the fire department and stuff and wanted to get a career in that. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Well, in the process of driving, we come across a motorcycle wreck on the interstate. And he's like, hey, man, like, we should probably pull over and see what they need. And I was like, all right, man, like, you're the expert. I'm just the guy sitting in the passenger seat. And so we go over, and it was a pretty bad motorcycle wreck. CPR was in progress. And so he jumped right in and was just like, hey, man, do you know how to do CPR? I was like, yeah. And he's like, all right, hop in. He was doing some of the directing of things, and I was just the guy doing CPR. And when it was all said and done, we hop back on the road, and I'm just like kind of out of my mind. Like, what in the heck did I just witness? Like an experience.
Yeah.
He was like, dude, you did awesome. He's like, I know like you're looking to like not travel so much. He's like, yeah, have you ever thought of the fire service as like a career? And I was like, not really. He's like, well, you should look into volunteering and see if you like it. And if you do, like, it's another avenue that you could look at. And I was like, all right. Well, at the time I was living in Golden, Colorado, and I was like, geez, I don't even know if they have a volunteer department, a paid department. So I looked it up, and they had a volunteer department, and they just happened to be taking applications at the time. So I put in my name and got selected, went through their academy. Yeah, I started volunteering and then fell in love with it, right? Like my first officer was awesome. Like he was just like, hey, have you ever done this? It's like, no. It's like, all right, hop on, let's do this. It's just like, all right, cool. So I think the first day at the fire station, he's like, you ever been up the ladder? And I was like, nope. He's like, all right, hop on. Like, let's go do this. And so it was just always fun. Like he gave you the kind of latitude to go explore it and have fun with it without being so like thumb on. So I think sometimes we have the leash a little too short sometimes, but he left the leash really long, which was awesome.
And then what was the process from volunteer to full time?
So when I realized like, man, if I could make a job out of it, like this would be awesome, right? Like I think everybody that kind of finds the fire service falls in love with it. It's hard not to, right? I was like, okay, I want to make a career of it. Like, where do I start? So having the volunteer side of it, they were like, hey, you should apply here, here, and here. Denver was a little bit in that surrounding area. They had like a consortium kind of thing that you could do. Then individual departments would do their individual thing. So I tested solid for like 3 years trying to get on, and then finally got on to a small department that's like, it doesn't exist anymore. It was sandwiched between Denver Fire, Aurora Fire, and South Metro. And it was like this little obscure small department wedged between these massive departments on either side. So 3-station department. It was awesome. It was like all the cool calls of like a big department, but like the nice part of everybody knew each other, and like, yeah, it was, and like really good dudes.
Did they get swallowed up by a bigger department on their board then?
Yeah. So right before I left, they were in talks with trying to merge with South Metro. And then I think, when did I leave? 2013 or 14. They ended up merging with South Metro. It was just funny because, like, being a smaller department, the windows of opportunity are pretty narrow. Dude, they moved to South Metro, which is like Candyland, and like, dude, all those guys are just thriving. It's awesome. Like, you catch up to a couple of them here and there, and it's like, hey, how's everybody doing? It's like, oh, so and so is like doing this, and it's like, oh yeah, I could totally see it, right? And like, but yeah, they're all just thriving, so it's cool to see.
So you've been the rookie 4 times. So just walk me through each department and sort of why you chose to join and leave and why you landed where you are.
I think I have a problem with self-abuse.
Or commitment. I don't know.
Being a rookie 4 times, I guess I just like beatings. See, I was a rookie at Golden, then at Cunningham, and then at some point I got married in the process of all that, and we had our first 2 kids. And so my folks still live here in Casper, and they would come down when they could, but like as they were getting older, like it's harder for them to get through Denver to get to us, right? And so their trips became less frequent, and so we decided, like, hey, like we could use some help with the kiddos as they get older, and it would be nice to have the kiddos close to family so that they actually get to see and know their grandparents. My wife's parents live in Oregon, and so they're pretty far away. Mine weren't that far away, so I was like, well, maybe we move and get the kiddos closer. So that was the big precipice of doing that. And so I was like, okay, well, if I'm doing that, they always say it's easier to transfer when you're already in the system, right? So I was like, all right. And I had a buddy that worked for the county fire department where Casper, like the county that Casper's in. He had nothing but good things to say about that department. So I was like, all right. And he's like, yeah, the testing process is pretty straightforward, like simple. I put in and had to go do like an oral interview and somehow got selected. And so like it happened so fast that, like, yeah, I was just like, oh, okay, I guess this is happening. And like all of a sudden we were out of Colorado and living in Wyoming again. And then from there, after I guess it was like half a year at that department, the city and like the county does a lot of wildland stuff. And don't get me wrong, wildland's fun, but it just reminded me of living out of my suitcase again. And I was like, that was the whole point of joining the fire service, was to get out of like living out of my suitcase all the time, and so to speak. And so I really liked the city side of firefighting, the structural side. So I applied for the city department and got on there after, I guess, yeah, it's been like 3/4 of a year or something like that. Finally got on there, and then that's where I've been since. So.
And when did you first start instructing?
It was shortly after getting on with the city. So it was interesting because like I'd started, when I started at Golden, I had really good instructors. I had a really good training chief. They were really encouraging of their people to like give back, right, to the department. And so in any kind of training regard. So it started, I would say, like maybe a year or 2 after I got on at Golden, just teaching the guys in Golden stuff that I'd learned or picked up, whether it was new guys helping with their new academies and stuff like that. That started the whole process. And then when I got on Cunningham, after a while, like I was helping with some of the classes because we were starting to work more with South Metro. So like I would go down and be like an adjunct for South Metro's multi-company trainings and stuff like that, which was awesome. Like it just kind of fueled the fire. They have such a strong training division down there. It's unbelievable. So like that fueled the passion. And then I came up to Wyoming, and it's different, right? Like every department's different in their own ways, right? And so I came up and I kind of still had that passion, but there weren't as many opportunities. So I just started, once I left the county and got on the city, I started just actually going to to classes. I would find classes that were good and then try to go to as many as I could, whether the department paid for them or not. And in the process, like met up with Gary Lane and those guys. And actually I met Gary through a random phone call. We were looking at getting new hose, and I was too scared to call Dennis Laguerre to talk to him about hose. He's got his own separate business, right? And I was like, I don't want to call him and ask him for a bunch of free information when like he's trying to live off of helping departments out. Not really knowing who Dennis was too. Like I was just like, he's kind of a big deal, and I'm just a dude in the middle of Wyoming trying to sort out the hose stuff so we didn't buy poor hose. And so yeah, I called up Gary, and in the process like of talking to Gary, we hit it off. I think the first phone conversation we had, it was like 2 hours long. We had a very similar experiences and ups and downs. And he answered all my questions about hose. And so, yeah, like we just kind of hit it off. He was telling me about, was it Harrisburg, some other stuff. And so like, yeah, we just started like meeting up at all these different conferences or whatever.
Was he involved with Brothers in Battle, or how did you get involved?
He kind of had his own thing going. At first it was Rogue Fire. I think it was like what he was teaching under at the time. We didn't find Brothers in Battle until Firemanship asked him to come out and do the DIY class. And so I had taken his class in Harrisburg, and he was like, hey, we're doing this class in Harrisburg. It's under live fire. The place is awesome, like really good department. It's going to be cool. You should come out to it. And so I was like, all right. And so, yeah, I booked a ticket, paid for the conference, and went out and like met up with those guys and kind of helped them do some build out when they were building out, because I got there early and took the class. And I was like, dude, that class was awesome, because it's not like your typical engine company class in the regards of like, oh, like, you know, this is how you hold a hose line. This is how you move through a building. This is what you do with the stream. It was more of a mind. I always call it psyops now, because it's like what happens in your mind when everything goes wrong or you're hit with all these different inputs, right? And that class starts out very slow, and then like the stressors just build. And so it's like, how do you accomplish the goals that you're set out to do of finding victims and putting out fire when the stresses just keep adding up? And so, yeah, it's more of a mind thing than most people get. But
yeah, it sounds similar to Rick George's Courage Within.
I know who Rick George is and I know what he's been doing, but like, I don't know if they're really super similar. And the fact that like this one's more of like taking what has screwed us up on calls, like us personally, and then wrapping them into like, how did we get through it? And then how do we help other people get through it? Right. So like a lot of this comes from Gary and like just calls that he was on where it was like things just didn't go right, or like little things pull your brain somewhere else, and then you end up screwing something else up.
When you add all the stimuli in, it changes things.
That's a fact. We were teaching up in Idaho, and it's so funny. Like I remember playing a role of somebody on the outside, just throwing more stress at him. And like at one point, like one of the students like grabs me, and his eyes are like as big as saucers. And I was like, yep. And this is where I get punched in the face. Right. Like, and luckily he didn't. And then afterwards he was like, dude, you had me so stressed out that like I couldn't function on like what I was actually supposed to be doing. And it's like, yeah, it's just to show you how easy it can happen, right? Like I'm just a dude standing outside, like getting in your way. Like how easy is it to pull you out of your mindset of the task that you're supposed to actually do?
And that's even at a course level, not even at a real call level.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like this is just training, right? Like and I always tell people, I was like, man, like expect the unexpected in the real world. If you can dream it up, don't be surprised if you see people actually doing it on real call, because people they lose their minds. And when they do, like they do some really crazy stuff. One of the funniest things that I think happened to me on a fire, a couple years ago, we roll up and I was acting engineer at the time. I hop off the rig and this dude comes running up to me. It's obviously his house. He's going to give me some good information. And he's just like, is that my house that's on fire? And I'm like, dude, it totally locked me up. I'm like, wouldn't you know that's your house if it's on? I don't know how to answer this, dude. Like it totally locked me up it seemed like a long time, but I just remembered like stopping and being like, what? Like you should know if this is your house or not. Like, yeah, it was just the funniest thing. So I think I threw that into one of the classes shortly thereafter. Like, hey man, is that my house that's on fire? Like,
how did Engine Zero come about?
In the process of taking some classes, right? Like I took Aaron Fields' class, Nozzle Forward. It's so much information so fast, right? And then you hit the drill grounds and like you're trying to put some of the stuff that he's showing you into use, and it just never felt comfortable. And so when I got done with that, and I've taken his class a couple of times now, I just never could get it right. And so I was like, all right, well, the only way to get better, right, is just get reps. And so I always wanted, when I was on shift, to go out and get some reps in. There's downtime. Maybe it's not the most energetic crew, right? It's like, I still need to go work on some stuff. So instead of, hey, can I pull the rig out, tie into a hydrant, stretch some lines, right? Because you ask that a couple of times and like, yeah, they might be like, oh, yeah, like we can go out and do it. And then like when you ask them every day, right? Like at some point they're like, hey man, we can't be taking the rig out of service, right? Like all the time for this, and like, or delay our response because you're tied into a hydrant the whole time. And so I was like, well, I guess I could just tie into the hydrant and just use the hose and like adjust the length of hose to the pressure of the hydrant. So I get somewhat similar feel for the nozzle reaction, and I can go about my business. And it's so funny because when I first went out, I was at a pretty slow station and I was like, all right, like set everything up. And I'm like, all right, I think this hydrant is like around this pressure. So I'll use this section of hose and like, I'll be good. And I opened up the line and dude, I got dumped. I have video of it because like that was the other thing, is I was like, I'll take some video, so because there's nobody else around to like help. Hey man, like or nobody else had taken the class to be like, hey man, like when I did it, like it was
Put your hand here, put your foot here. Yeah.
I'd called fields as well and like talked to them, and like you're like trying to have a conversation while visualizing what they're using for words, and I could just never could quite understand what he was trying to explain to me. So I was like, all right, I'm just going to go do it. And so I was like, I'll video it and then I'll use that and I'll just study it to see what I'm doing wrong. And like literally the first one, dude, I open the line and just get thrown like 10 feet backwards, like, like, but in the process of that, like I did it religiously, like every day I would go out, and like it was kind of just my own little Zen time to like work through whatever was going on, and try to master being a good at manipulating that hose line, trying to learn how to flow and move off of it. Hit and move's pretty easy, right? Like there isn't much to hit and move. It's pretty straightforward, but like to be able to flow and move and to do it comfortably, to like visualize where you're at in that building and do it, that was such a process. In the process of doing all of that, I was like, well, I should share some of this because I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person that like has been struggling with this. You go to nozzle forward and like, dude, I was looking at people. I'm like, I don't understand how you're so good at this. Like, I can't figure this out at all. And so then I was like, all right, there's got to be other people. I'll start filming it and I'll just show like what I'm working on. And hopefully that'll inspire people to go out and do it on their own as well, right? This is kind of a long way of saying how I got to Engine Zero. In the process of doing all that, like I would build hose beds out of whatever I could. At first it was pallets. I'd made them out of pallets and I'd set them up out back and like work on hose stretches. There's days that I worked on flowing. Well, in the process, I got asked by Brian Brush to go down and help. He was in Colorado teaching the exponential engine. And so he's like, hey man, I need some help. I was like, all right, cool. I'll go down. I'll help you. So I came down, we did the class, and we had built these hose props. This is like the nicest hose prop I've worked with. Like, do they want it? And he's like, I don't think they do. I was like, can I take it home? He's like, sure. So I threw it in the back of my truck and took it home. And then I took it to the station. It was in the station for a while. And one of my buddies from another neighboring station happened to come through, and we were out either training or whatever, they were filling in for our station. He went over and took some tape and just like taped out Engine Zero on the side of it. We come into the station and I look over and I just see this E-0 in tape on the side of it. And I was like, who the hell did that? So like, I was like, oh shit, I bet you it was Chris. So I called him up and I'm like, hey man, like you tagging my stuff? And he's like, I thought it was appropriate. And so then I sat there and I was like, I took it outside. I was going to do some stretching off of it. And I'm just like, dude, that's brilliant. It matches everything like zero excuses, right? Like zero ego, just go out and just work on your craft. Not because like you want to be better than anybody, but just because you want to be better for yourself, right? And so like that was kind of that was what was going on in my head every time I went out. It was just like there's no judgment or anything. It was just like I just personally want to get better at this. And so I was just like, man, Engine Zero, that like it's got a ring to it. So I stuck with it. And then I mean, I've been pretty fortunate. I ran into the right people at the right time. I think Von Oppen was the one that really solidified that like zero excuses, zero ego. He sent me a couple of things because he had a big impact on those early years when I moved up here to Wyoming with like his message. I ended up with 4 sticks of hose from one of the vendors. I was like, hey, what are you doing with this hose? And he's just like, because we were using it as demo hose. He's like, oh, you can have it. And so like I put the Von Oppen's Big 4 on it and took a picture of it. And like, dude, like that blew way up. He really enjoyed it. He was like, holy shit. And like, once he posted it, I was floored by the response of all of that. And so then we would go back and forth, kind of helping each other out with like photos that would help him. And then he sent back zero ego, zero excuses. And I was like, that's it. It's perfect.
How did the hose bed get destroyed?
I guess it was in the way. And then in the process of them moving it to the outside, they just crushed it. I left one day and it was fine. And I came in one day and it was in pieces sitting against the outside of the station. You can look at it how you want on that regard. Like I kind of know what happened. It was pretty eye-opening. I was just like, okay, a simple, hey man, can you get this out of the station would have sufficed. I would have came on my day off and taken it. Anyway, I still have it, but it's in my backyard and I've put it back together for one of our conferences and taken it back apart. But like, I didn't want to lose that taped Engine Zero. So when I got home, I spray painted over the top of it and then peeled the tape off. So it'll be there for a while.
I'm sure you've encountered this where people will take a class or be shown a skill in a conference or by a coworker and they're not immediately good at it and they think the skill sucks. Maybe speak to why that wasn't your mentality when you can't get a handle on something and maybe how you've handled people when they have that perception.
I can't really speak for everybody else. But for me personally, it's that once you have like an unknown and you realize that like there is a known associated with it, it's hard to go back to the unknown, right? And so what I mean by that is if you would have told me early in my career, like, yeah, you can flow and move a hand line and like you can do it by yourself. If somebody could manage the bends and the kinks and or like where the hose hangs up, you can pull that hose wherever you want to go and never shut it off. Like I would have thought you crazy. And then you go and you see it and you're like, well, shit, like if they can do it, like what's wrong with me that I can't do it? Then it was like, okay, well, it's known, right? Like now I have a known. I need to go and like, and make sure that I have this in my Rolodex because again, like we don't really get to choose the fires that we go to, right? And, or when we actually need that in a fire. But I sure don't want to be in there going, man, if I only knew how to flow and move, like this fire would be slam dunked right now and everything would get better. And so that's kind of how I thought about it. That process was, I should have talked about it earlier, but that process was painful. I had to totally break everything down to basically a nozzle and dry hose. Like in those classes, there's a limited amount of time, right, that you have with a student or a group of students, right? And so if there's 30 students, right, like you can't pull them off aside and be like, okay, like here's where these little things are going wrong for you, right? It's just like, hey, this is how we do it. Like give it a couple of whirls and then we're going to move on to the next thing, right? Because of time and the number of students, right? So when you're out there by yourself, you have all the time in the world. And so, yeah, I had to break it down though. I literally started, and you're using 2 different parts of your body doing 2 different things is how I had to stop and look at it. It's not just one congruent movement, right? Like your lower body is doing something totally different than your upper body. I was just like, all right, first things first, figure out the lower body. Don't worry about the upper body because I couldn't even get that down. I started doing that. And then I was like, okay, I think I got it. I'm making progress. Right. And so then it was like, okay, now that you're making progress, before you add any other inputs to it, like now work on the upper body and try to get it so that you're not thinking about the lower body anymore. Your lower body is just going, and now your upper body can just focus on this. And that was about the hardest thing I think I've ever done. It took a long time to get those two things to happen simultaneously. Because the second you would think about one, you would stop thinking about the other.
And the nozzle starts moving or stops moving or it drops or.
Oh, yeah. Like every time I thought about how my lower body was moving, my upper body would stop. And then every time I would be focused on this, like I would screw up something silly in my lower body. And so like just trying to get the neural pathways to develop and then like insulate them enough to actually make that be the permanent highway of information took a while. And it took breaking it down to just the hose and the nozzle. Then it was and not flowing any water or anything. And then adding water to it to get that weight. And then I was like, okay, I feel pretty comfortable with that. Now here comes the hard part, adding nozzle pressure to it. And that's where when I first started with the nozzle reaction part of it, I would gate down the hydrant. I would make it so that it was maybe 30 PSI at the tip, maybe, right? And I would open that line and just try to get a feel for that pushback and like, how is it pushing my body? By that time, like both the upper and lower body were doing their thing appropriately, right? And now I was just worried about like that balance of, okay, what happens when I start adding pressure? And then finally one day it all clicked and I was like, sweet, like I feel like I'm pretty good at this. And then I was like, I wonder how I am on the other side. Because like at the same time frame, right? Like I'm helping out teaching with a bunch of different people. I don't know if like it just clicked in my mind or if somebody said it, but it was just like the building dictates how you move through it, right? Whatever's inside that building, whether it's the noise of everybody's stuff, right? The fire itself, the smoke conditions, all that stuff kind of dictates how you move through that fire environment. And it's like, okay, well, if all I have is the right side, right? Because I'm really good at the right side. What happens when I turn a corner and lo and behold, the hose is on my left side and now I need to flow and move? And I was like, well, shit, I don't know. Like, I guess I should practice that. And so what I found is once I had the right side down, it was really easy for my left side to like catch up.
You got to think about it again, but you can translate it.
Yeah, like the translation was a lot easier. And then on top of it, like I knew the movements of that lower body, upper body, right? It was just, I'm just using a different leg to like start everything off. And it's all those little things that like unlock things. The biggest thing that unlocked for me was like, you have to have your hips up and like pushed forward, right? So like you have to be kind of high on that knee to allow your legs to move. If you're sitting back on your heels, you don't have enough room for your legs to like actually do what they need to do. And so that unlocking that was kind of like finding the Dead Sea Scrolls. You're like, oh, sweet. Like I just figured out what this language is, right?
Do you teach people now in this sort of same sequence? Do you have them just work on lower body and not worry about the nozzle movement and then at lower pressures? And
in a perfect world, yes. Like when I have time, it was funny because I'd set up a kind of like Nozzle Forward does, right? You set up the pallet walls, right, to like work on moving. So we'd set that up out back, and my engineer at the time was just like, hey man, like that looks really cool. Like, can you show me how to do it? Right. And so like, I didn't start out with like just a dry line per se. Actually, I'm trying to think back. I think I actually did with him. I was like, here, just work on these movements, right, with a dry line, and then we'll add everything in. After a while, it's actually kind of easy to just be like, okay, here's a line with water in it, and this is what you need to work on, right? Like get those hips up. The other big thing is like not extending that up leg, your foot out too far before you try to go forward on it.
Small movements.
Yeah, it's like it's all hamstring, right? And nobody's hamstring strong enough to pull the rest of their body weight as well as the weight of the line and all that. So I was like, hey, the big takeaway is like, A, get your hips up so that you have room for your legs to move. And then B, that forward foot has to come back so that your toes are under your knee. And then it's just a controlled fall forward onto your knee. And I was like, so you're basically moving the length of your shin every time you move. It's funny because like the other thing that came from all this was noticing that when we're outside, right, we have the benefit of eyesight. We have the benefit of unrestricted movement for the most part, right? Once we get interior and we take away vision and stuff like that, we don't move as fast. Training outside in a parking lot, like you always hear this, like it's not real or anything like that. And it's like, it's not supposed to be real, right? Like it's designed for a different purpose, like of learning those little skills, right? If all we do is that, then what we end up doing is like training ourselves to move way too fast when we hit the fire environment. And so I always try to tell people, like, once it clicked in my head, was like, hey, like out here, we're moving unimpeded, right? So we can move as fast as we want. Once we go inside, that all changes. So now the nozzle slows way down and those movements aren't happening super fast. And I was like, and because this leads to more heel work. And I was like, but what's the heel doing? They're still outside. So they're just jamming hose in, right? Like he's got to be like 20 feet in already. So they're just jamming hose in and like preloading way too much hose into that environment. And the nozzles only moved like maybe 5 or 10 feet, right? And now they're getting boa constricted by all the hose coming. So I try to slow everything down when we're outside. Like, hey, just take your time. Like, and that's where like I started trying to visualize in my head, whether it was a fire I went on or whether it's like just a fire, like, okay, I'm in a hallway, fire's in the back right bedroom. It's coming out into the hallway. What do I want to do? Right. And so then like, it's just like, okay, as I'm following this line, what's happening, right? And like just painting that picture in my head so that it slows me down outside.
Yeah, so much of the why matters.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. And I try to explain to people too, like, because there's a lot of talk about training scars, right? And like, I think before the training scars were like, you'll just do what I say, right? And like those kind of scars, but like when you really dive into something, you start to notice like how easy it is to like set yourself up for failure in certain things. And so when you're outside, the other thing that happens is there's so much space, your brain can't focus on anything other than the horizon. And I think this is why people are like, well, it's just like training out in the parking lot isn't realistic, because like they see them and they're always just shooting water straight out in front of them. And it's because that's the only target they have, right? Like, is the horizon.
Where the line's got to get up to and behind you or around you.
And that's the thing, is it's like you teach them out in a parking lot, right? And they program in this bad habit of like, I shoot water straight out in front, when in reality, when you go into a compartment, that string needs to go straight up, right? And then we're working it high to low, near to far, right? And it's a hard habit to break. And so I always tell people like, hey, like when we're out here, like you just slow down. Everybody knows you're a good firefighter, right? Like, because again, like our ego, our self-worth, right, is like all wrapped up into us as a firefighter, right? And like, and there's nothing harder than being judged by a jury of our peers, right? And so it's like, I don't want to look like a tool out here. So if I go really fast and like show that I'm a kick-ass firefighter, like maybe I won't have to hear about all the jabs from the peanut gallery, right? Then we build these training scars where we're moving so fast, we're not focused on like what the real outcome is. And that real outcome is when I'm going into a new compartment, that line needs to be up, right? If I have people searching in front of me, that line needs to be up. If I'm opening the line straight out in front of me, I'm going to be laser blasting face pieces off of people searching in front of me, or I'm not going to get water immediately where I need it, which is above me, to protect my space first and then push it all away.
Do you find that's what you've honed the most over time of teaching this, is knowing when to address what could possibly be a training scar and you drop that little bit in with the skill?
Absolutely. So like, it's not me that really helped myself in instructing. It's more my wife. She coaches soccer. And so like, she's always like watching, and she played soccer on a pretty high level, Division I soccer in California. And so she really understands the game, right? So when she goes to coach it, she can really break it down, right? And so like, I think once you start getting a higher level of understanding in things. You can watch people and what they're doing and then like break it down for them so that they're not making those mistakes. When you go into real buildings, it's really easy to show, right? So like you allow the student, like you've shown them a skill, right? And now you're asking them to move through this building doing that skill, right? As they move through, you're watching how they're making that water move. And then you're like, okay, but when they opened that door and they moved into that compartment, their first water was still straight out in front of them. So it's like, okay, hey, like that was awesome, but let's go back and like who's got a flashlight, right? And like you flash it up on the ceiling, you're like, we still have dry spots, right? Like if we open this door and the fire that I've painted for you in here, because again, trying to find live fire classes is almost impossible in our litigious era that we're in. It's like, okay, you have fire coming out of this bedroom. It's rolling across the ceiling towards the door you just opened, right? Like, what do you want to do? And so they come in and like immediately that hose stream is too low. And then you can pull them back and you can show them like, hey, just look up. Like it's dry right here. Is that what we want? We had an intense heat coming at us, right? Like that has the potential of stuff above us being on fire, whether we know it or not, or can see it or not, right? And so it's like, why not just rule it out? It's like, so when you cross that threshold, that line immediately goes up. And then I try to explain to them, like, because the other thing is like, we don't really see what happens to water in like a smoky environment, right? Like, how's this water moving across these surfaces, right? Ray McCormick's done a great job of like showing like water doesn't just hit and bounce down, right? But it's still a hard concept. And if you haven't seen Ray McCormick or know who Ray McCormick is, right? Like you still think like water's ping ponging off of everything, bouncing off the walls. And so you can explain it to them too. It's like, okay, so what do you think what happens when you point that nozzle straight up? And it's like, well, the water hit, like some people will say the water hits and comes right back down. It's like, well, no, it actually hits the surface and rains out. And it's like, where does it rain out? Right. And it's like all directions. If you go straight up, it's a 360-degree fan of water that's going everywhere, right? So if I can do that immediately coming into that compartment, it immediately wets the back wall. I don't have to really worry about that too much. And then from going straight up, if I can go side to side, I've ruled out all of it, and now I can move on. And so it's just like watching them and then bringing them back and like just and allowing the rest of the group to hear it. Because that's the other thing is like you have to almost repeat it a bunch of times before it really sets in. Because I've been there where like I've pulled the group that just went back and like as the big class group, I'm like, okay, like everybody look, right? Like, and so then the next group comes in and they get it a little bit better, but it's not quite all the way. And it's like, hey, that was better, but like we still have, right? You should have water raining down the back of your neck, right? The next group, it just gets a little bit better. And then finally somebody hits it and they're just like, that's it. Like, I'm going to do it right and make it rain everywhere. And so then like, it just kind of takes those reps, but it takes an active instructor to watch people to see what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong, and having an understanding of how, not necessarily the right way or the wrong way, but just ways to correct their movements to help them.
Yeah, you're also having the foresight to see ahead where that skill, if they take that into calls, where it's going to go.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, hey man, like you don't have to flow and move every fire, right? Like, but having that in your hip pocket for when you do need to, dude, you'll be a legend. All of a sudden he just opened the line. It never stopped until the fire was completely out. And it's just like being able to watch him, right? And you're just like, okay, hey, at first it was a lot of that mechanics for handling a hose line. Nowadays, I think it's become so normalized that like they'll show up to class and you're like, damn man, like you've got it. Like, that's awesome. It's just like little bits here and there to like help them streamline it. The biggest one I see right now is like heel work. I think we overcomplicate it a lot. And so then like trying to help them realize like the best way, the most efficient way to like move hose line without causing more work for the nozzle or more work for them.
Which comes back to pace, right?
Exactly. And like usually what happens when there's unlimited visibility is the pace is like a million miles an hour. And so then your heel can't keep up. So like, yeah. And then you get this herky jerky, like we're hauling ass to like a huge stop, pause, right? Like reset, hauling ass again. And instead of like everything just kind of happening without any real slowdown or pause in the attack.
Has any of the UL research that's come out helped you sort of not sell people on it, but show? I mean, obviously before all of that, it was kind of anecdotal. Has it helped you speak to it with students and maybe naysayers?
It's reinforced all of it. When you're bringing new stuff like that, that like is, like you said, anecdotal, like it's hard for people to understand because there's not a whole lot of science behind it, or the man with the black briefcase coming in and being like, this is how it is, right? Like it's hard for people to get behind it. The UL has come out with all their stuff, and all of it has been awesome in that regard of like, hey, remember when we were talking about all this? Like, here's now the science behind it, and here's what it's actually doing. And it just helps reinforce like everything that we've been doing or everything that we've been talking about. And then you can reference back to it, right? And it's like a solid reference point. So I think everything that they've been doing has been super helpful to the fire service, and then to help aid instructors in how they deliver that message, right? Like, hey, I'm delivering this message, and now here's the reference material that helps back it up. Because they can get away with a lot of cool fires that like a lot of us can't do. Like rare is the department that's like, hey, we totally decked out this room in the fire burn building with a couch, a bed, chairs, lamps, all the stuff that everybody's like, oh my God, like that stuff will kill you, right? And it's like, yeah, agreed. But at some point, like we're going into a building that's on fire that has that and more.
Maybe not training with it will kill you too.
Right, exactly. And like right now, dude, live fire in the fire services, God, it seems so taboo. And it's like, I think gone are the days guys are pouring 5-gallon buckets of diesel mix on hay bales and like then throwing on top of it chunks of old hose and stuff like that. Like I think we're past that, and I think we can build fires that achieve what we want it to achieve without being like, oh dude, you're not a salty firefighter unless you can eat the heat. And it's just like, all right, like is that what we're trying to teach them, or are we trying to teach them to like be good firefighters and not even experience that because they've already opened the line, right? I think Field says it best. Like there's no line of duty death where like they found a firefighter with a line open.
No one drowns to death in a fire. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so getting back to the UL has done so much good stuff with those fires, and then putting numbers to it and showing us real world applications or real world science to kind of what we're doing in our trainings and stuff, or in the real world environment that we go into. So it's been helpful. They built a flow prop, and I was like, dude, why didn't I think of that? Like where it's like plexiglass, right? And so because like that's one of the hardest things is like you got 15 students behind you staring down a hallway or into a compartment, and like they're all jockeying for a line of sight, and then some of them just don't see what that water is doing. And now like, yeah, with the plexiglass, you can show them, they can stand outside and just be like, oh, that's what water does. Oh, that's what properly water mapping is. Yeah, a lot of really cool stuff. I love that they use a lot of subject matter experts from the fire service themselves, like to kind of vet it as well, right? Like, hey, like, what about this? They all come together and come up with the process to do their evaluations, but it allows buy-in by the rest of the fire service. It's a really good idea. Instead of just like, two dudes in their white lab jackets, like, hey, let's start some fires.
I found it super helpful to use acquired structure tick footage. I got that from Jay Bonifield. He shared a bunch with me. So to watch that with people and to show them the why.
I still don't know how he gets so many acquired structures, dude. That's the other thing is I think the burn house here in Casper is like 40 some years old. It's the same layout it's always been, right? Like at some point you're just like, okay, like I could literally go through this thing blindfolded and like semi-conscious and still get to the seat of the fire without any hangups, right? When you have acquired structures, it's a whole different ballgame. It's just unfortunate that like those days of eating the heat kind of, I think, ruined it for a lot of departments. And like, hey, we don't want to assume that liability for burning in it. And instead of like, hey, how can we engineer this so that we can get what we want out of it without putting people in jeopardy?
There's a fine balance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it just takes checking your ego at the door sometimes.
No, that's a great segue. So talk to me about ego as the enemy, character building, turning inward. Maybe you can tie in your bike experience when you were logging. We can even touch back to that. So just talk to me about building character over your life.
The ego is the enemy portion. I had some pretty dark times in the fire service. I can't say as you can imagine because I don't know very many people that can imagine it. But like when you're trying to introduce new ideas or you show up and like you're not at ground level, you've been through years in the fire service, but now you're showing up somewhere new with all this experience, right? From a different source. When you step into that environment, like there is a high potential that that environment you step into is already has a negative tone towards you, right? Of who is this guy and like why does he think he knows everything, right? Like we're used to having new guys where we tell them how it is or whatever the case may be, or we teach them to what we do.
They have their empire already built.
Right. And don't get me wrong, like respect is earned, right? Like, but like there can be like a dark side to stepping into that and bumping into egos and people that just don't have like the right intentions of like what it takes to bring somebody new into the fold. And so some of that stuff came down on me pretty hard, especially my passion for the fire service is pretty deep. And I think it kind of goes back and we'll touch on it, my past a little bit. I mean, I played team sports my whole life. And even when I was climbing, I climbed with a group of people and we all supported each other and we all wanted each other to get better, right? Having that in my background of like, hey, as an outsider stepping in, like there's little things that we can tweak to make us better, right? Like, why wouldn't we try? But sometimes people don't like change and they definitely don't like change fast, right? And so you kind of bump into some of those egos and then you end up kind of getting beat down because of it. I've had a lot of things said about me or my character that wasn't true that led to other people that didn't know me, like just believing it and then being isolated. I've definitely been written up a few times because usually what ends up happening is like a backlash happens at some point, right? Like you back an animal into a corner and continue to try to beat on it. Like at some point it's going to bite. I'll admit, like, yeah, I've had some backlashes that have landed me into a lot of trouble. Those dark days, like you kind of turn inward. I really isolate, like I've even to this day, like I find more comfort in being alone than being in groups of people. And so like that has fostered it, I think, a little bit. But in the process of doing that, I started looking inward. Like how can I change to be a better person, right? Dude, somewhere along the lines, I found the Stoic philosophy and started reading a lot of Stoic books and like finding that message resonated with me. One of the big ones was like ego is the enemy. Like there should be no ego. Like you're just another human, right? Whether you're the king of the world or the peasant drinking out of the gutter, right? Like you're still a human. I've gotten away from like thinking of myself as anything special, right? I'm just another person on the planet trying to help other people. That's been kind of good for me. I'm not special. I know I'm not. Like I treat the most important person in the world to the poorest person the same way, right? Like with kindness and grace and try to do that, right? Like knowing full well we're human, we make mistakes. I started telling people like that's the beauty of the human experience is like we make mistakes. It's like how do we learn from them? But to get back to kind of how like some of that started, we talked about logging. That first year logging, my dad was like, hey, next week, like you're going to go help Jack, which was the guy that was helping us build the cabin, like log. And I was like, okay, so are you taking off work? Like, how am I couldn't drive, right? It's like, so like, we're just staying up at the cabin all week. And he's like, no, like, we're going to take you up to the cabin. You're going to stay there all week. We'll bring your bike up. You can mountain bike over to work and back. You'll be on your own. And I was like, well, that sounds kind of fun, right? Like, what an adventure. How bad can it possibly be? they dropped me off. We had a nice meal that evening, and they were like, all right, see you. And I was like, cool, I'm going to go for a mountain bike ride. Like, this is awesome. Finally, that independence I've always wanted. No parents to tell me what to do. I took off on a mountain bike ride, and like an idiot, I was like, I bet you I can go down this. And like took off cross country down a hill and ended up like eating it, just rolling my bike and myself. Ended up like breaking my rear derailleur on my mountain bike. So I'm like, I get up and I'm like, hey, I'm okay. So that's good. And then I'm like, but my bike's trashed. I spent like the next hour trying to like somehow fix it because I was like, how the hell am I going to get to work now? This guy's expecting me to show up to work tomorrow, and I guess I can just walk. Because I was going to take the road around on my mountain bike because there's really no trail. And I was like, well, it might be better. I'll just go cross country on foot and save a little bit of time. Woke up at the butt crack of dawn. I didn't know how long it was going to take, so I left like super early, wandered over there, worked all day. Yeah, that walk back, I was exhausted. There was a section of forest I had to go through, and it was getting dark. I got lost in that section of forest because I was super tired. I had no idea where I was at. I was just like out of it. And like, I remember just losing it. I was like, dude, this is ridiculous. Like, I'm up here all alone, no help, no nothing. Right. And finally ended up popping out of the trees. And I was like, all right, I kind of know where I'm at. And I got to a ridge and I was like, okay, I wasn't where I thought I was, but now I know where I'm at. And I finally get back to the cabin and I'm cooking dinner at like 9 o'clock at night because I got back so late. And I was just like, Jesus, dude, I was like, what, 13 or 14, like just kind of like having this surreal experience of like being totally alone. There's no help. You got to just kind of do it on your own. It's funny because when you provided these, like I hadn't thought about that in a long time. It's like what the old rites of passage used to be, right? Like you would send these kids out to go do something, right? Like whether it was to go on a vision quest or go out and bring back food for the tribe or whatever, but like they did it on their own. I didn't realize how much it had changed me, but like my parents, like if you ask them, they're like, oh yeah, like we left him, he was a kid. When we came back, like he was no longer that same kid. And it's made me like pretty good on the individual level of like, and then the problem solving level. Yeah, like I got this. Yeah, I just need to do this, and this, and almost maybe to a fault. I get sometimes way too independent, but.
And what about your journey into sort of trying therapy and self-help?
When you kind of go to some of those darker places, like, and you kind of don't want to leave your house or anything like that, like you're looking for ways to like come out of it. I went to a psychiatrist, right? They have EAP or whatever, right, for the department. So I was like, oh yeah, I'll go there. Like I can talk to somebody and like maybe they can get me on the right path. And I remember like unloading on this guy. God, that poor guy. He was just like, the only thing I can really tell you is like you should probably find another job. And I was crushed, absolutely crushed. I was like, that's it? That's all you got for me? It's like take something that like I absolutely love doing and like I should just go find another job. I was like, I don't even know what I would do. So I was like, I left there and I was like, all right, well, it was probably good to get some of that stuff out and like not in my head anymore. So I'll take that as like kind of what EAP might have helped with. And then I was like, I just got to find other ways to get it out. And so I took off into all sorts of different directions. I think the easiest direction that a lot of people would go into is like some sort of physical beatdown of the body, right? Like I'm going to punish the body to like appease the mind. I was like, man, I've never really liked running, but like it would be cool to like see what an endurance race is like. I don't think I'd run over a couple of miles at most at the time. And I was like, man, I think I'm going to sign up for some ultra marathons.
Yeah, not just a marathon.
Yeah, not just a marathon.
Something like, that says ultra in
marathons are so lame. I'm going to go well above that. Yeah, I got online one night and was just like, all right, like where's the toughest race around me, right? And like I wasn't looking for like the longest race. I was like looking for the most punishing race I could find. And I was like, all right, found one in northern Colorado called the Never Summer 100 kilometer. And I was like, perfect. I'll start training for that. My wife's a physical therapist. So the place that she was working at had a trainer and a super nice guy. And so I was like, hey, man, like, would you help me train for this ultra marathon? And he's like, sure. So like I would go in and like do 2 hour just punishment sessions with him all the time. And then I really like a lot of his training wasn't a whole lot of like actual running. I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, to do running, you got to run. Right. And like this was like, it was just like, no, you got to, like, we got to work on your VO2 max. Like, we got to do some other stuff. And so I punished my body that way. And like in the process, like opened up my mind to just kind of let some of that stuff go. I remember I was like standing on the start of that race and I'm just like, dude, what in the hell did I get myself into? Talking to a couple of people in the line. And there's this couple and I forget where they were from. Super nice. And they're like, is this your first race? I'm like, oh yeah. And they're like, well, have you like done any marathons or anything? I was like, no. And they're like, oh, well, here, like, just run with us for the first part. Like, don't go taking off like a bat out of hell. And I was like, all right. We just had this awesome, like, nice, slow, methodical run, just chatting and like laughing and joking. And like the rest of the race, I just remember I had the biggest smile on my face. Everybody I came across, like, hey, you're doing a great job. Nice work or whatever. I ran into a couple of guys somewhere halfway through and they're just like, it wasn't even halfway through. It was like probably the first marathon portion of it. Right. And like, they're like, how many ultras have you done? And I was like, this is the first one. And they're like, oh, well, how many marathons? And I'm like, I haven't done a single one. And they're like, really? And they're like, huh, man, that's crazy. And I was like, well, if you were in my head, yeah, like you'd probably say I wouldn't disagree. Right. And so then I ran into them later on and they're just like, oh, hey, man, like, congratulations on your first marathon. And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, dude, we're well over a marathon in. And I was like, dang, I didn't even pay attention. I was like, well, thanks. It was such a good experience for me mentally to like just kind of allow my body to wear out and my mind to let go. Yeah, it was cool. After that, like I found like listening to some podcasts. I listened to the Finding Mastery podcast because like it kind of went in tow with me trying to find mastery in that the art of the nozzle, right? And so, but in the process of listening to some of those, right, you get kind of like the psychological background and then ways to like kind of help deal with that. And so like I did a lot of meditation in that time period. Like I would like try to find apps that would help me do it because I was never really it's so hard for me to just like stop and allow it to happen. And then I started looking into some tech stuff. There's a little device called Apollo Neuro that like it's like vibrations. And so you wear it like a watch and like it basically like you can want to be in a happy mood and like it sends out these like you don't even really pay attention to it, but it sends out these frequencies through you. And I put it on. I was like, I don't know if this thing's going to work. And then all of a sudden I'm just like, and I'm like really at peace right now. And so I did that for a while. I bought like some light therapy things. So it was like light and sound. I used that for a little while, but like a lot of it was just like me just experimenting with myself to try to find some peace with some of this stuff.
Do you think the talk therapy portion would have gone differently if you had someone you connected with or that understood you?
After talking to people that have used that avenue, right? Like it's not so much that like they're a psychiatrist, it's the right psychiatrist for you. I did not run into the right psychiatrist by any stretch of the imagination. I think if like you do, like you really have to do your homework. I was just looking for something quick to like help. And then once I got that bad taste, I was just like, all right. And then I kind of revert back to like, well, I guess I'll just do it on my own and figure it out. And so went down that path.
How did the High Plains Fire Conference get started?
3 dudes sitting around wanting training. At the time, our chief wasn't really supporting it. And so we were like, well, maybe we can just do it on our own. 3 of us got together and we're like, all right, let's try to make this happen. put a lot of effort into that first year, kind of like sitting down, trying to figure out like, hey, who do we want to bring in? Like, what could benefit our department in the surrounding area, right? Like, there's conferences, it seems like everywhere now, but like Wyoming, there's kind of like a little black hole there. So we were like, how can we bring in good training and like help not only like the departments around us, but like the departments in the state as well, or in some of those neighboring states that might not have access to it, and like keep it cost effective enough that people can actually afford to go to it.
And they're not easy to run.
We're in the throes of it right now, and it's like, yeah, it's hard. It's very hard, especially I think the more successful you get with it, right? Like, or success is seen from the outside, like, oh, that's a successful conference. It definitely gets harder because more people want to have a stake in it. I think, you know what I mean? Like, departments are like, their influence is growing, right? And I think like sometimes it can be looked at in a negative light. Sometimes it can be looked at in a positive, right? It just kind of depends on the situation. Like, oh man, like this is awesome. Like, look at all the esprit de corps that's being built, blah, 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 right? And then in the negative light, it's like, well, are they trying to influence decisions on the department that we're supposed to be doing, right? Or whatever the case may be.
Are you stepping on toes almost? So they see it that way.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, I don't think anybody that starts up a fire conference is like, you know what I want to do? Step on toes. Like, I'll piss off every admin staff I come across, right? It's like, no, like, it's all for the betterment, right? Like, I think if you have that in your kind of mission right out of the gates of like, hey, all we want to do is make firefighters better, bring in good instructors, allow them to say their piece, and then allow the firefighters to make their decisions on like, hey, that was really good, or like, I don't know if that's even really in our wheelhouse, right? If you allow that to happen, like it's awesome, right? But at the same time, like, yeah, then don't be surprised when changes start happening, right? It's like when the UL comes out with their stuff, right? Like, change is going to happen based off of it, right? Like, it's inevitable. I always hated that saying, things that firefighters hate or change in the way things are, right? It's like, if any entity should have like that growth mindset 24/7, it should be the fire service. Now, things aren't really changing in the physical world of fire, right? Like, fire is fire and it happens the way it happens. Like, I'm pretty sure science has kind of nailed that one down. Things change in life, right? Like, we're not living in that 1930s, I got a bed made out of friggin' straw, right? Or whatever the case may be. It's like, things have changed in your house, things have changed in your car, things are going to change in how we operate now because of those changes, right? Like, we should have a growth mindset and like look at those things. And I think, and this is just me personally, I think we don't give the past enough credit for how robust of a system they had. I think nowadays we're like, oh, well, technology has solved all these things. It's got to be the latest and greatest and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, sometimes those old systems had built-in redundancy and were so simple because they didn't have that technology to like be that crutch. I still find it weird that like they're building fire engines with computer screens on them.
I was having the exact same thought while you're talking about it. I'm glad we have the fire apparatus we have and we're not pulling a horse-drawn steam pumper, right? But maybe a deck gun should stay analog. Maybe a pump panel should stay analog. As long as you're constantly push and test and try the new, if it's not going to solve the problem, it's going to make it more difficult, well, then that's not the direction to go. So you keep the old, right? And not everything old is good. Some things that are old need to change. I like that there's air conditioning in the trucks. That's nice too.
Yes, that is nice. Or heat.
Sure. Right. So
that's always a nice.
We're not sitting in open cabs anymore. So there's ways to move things forward. I'm glad we have the PPE we have now. And we don't, as much as we romanticize the patch coats and the boots and that. But I look at my dad's gear and I look at what we're able to do in our gear now, and I'm really happy we have it. So some new stuff is great.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is, it's like, but that vetting process, right? Of like, does this make sense? Like, does it make it like, and I shouldn't say easier. Does it make our job simpler, right? Because there's beauty in simplicity, right? Like, if you can break things down to its simplest form, it's actually harder to do that than it is to just add a bunch of stuff to it. And like it becomes easier because you've added all this complex stuff on top of it, right? Like bringing it down to its simplest form, and then it builds in redundancy. Like I look at nozzles and I'm just like, I don't understand why we have all these bells and whistles on all these nozzles. Like it makes no sense. It should be like a light switch. I should be able to turn it on or turn it off. That's it. I don't need to do anything different. And so I'm sure I'll catch a lot of hell for that. But like that's the thing is like I don't need a nozzle that like transforms into another nozzle. I don't need a nozzle that like as the nozzle firefighter, I'm like 95 isn't getting it. I think I'll turn it to 125, right? Like as if that's going to solve the problem.
Or it has an iPhone on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing is like, it's just, there's certain things that like I think they did in the past that like made a lot of sense. Some of it didn't. And some of this newer technology has really no business being in the fire service.
Yeah, so I think you hit it properly with the vetting, right? It's always looking at and challenging the old, trying the new, and seeing what the merge of those two is best.
Right. And like not getting so tunnel visioned on like, oh man, it's like the shiny thing, right? Like, oh, shiny thing. Oh, we should get that, right? It's the latest and greatest whiz bang thing. And it's just like, no, like we should probably like see if it actually works really well or see if it fits what we are doing.
You said you're in the mix of getting the next conference ready. When does it kick off?
That's a good question. We've been running into some roadblocks, so I don't really have a date yet. I mean, like we've announced kind of the date, but we ran into some lodging issues that we're trying to work with right now. So,
are you finding time to still go to conferences here and there, even though you've got everything going on with work and family and your own conference?
That's like one of the hardest things to balance out, right? Like you always hear about divorce rates in the fire service and stuff like that because like the fire service is kind of addicting. It's easy to jump into that rabbit hole and like take the wild ride to Alice in Wonderland. The hard thing is to find that balance, right? And so like especially when you get married, you have kids, trying to find a balance of like how much do I put into my passion of the fire service and how much do I put into the passion of my family life, and then throw in on the mix like teaching. There's always those waves, right, where you're like do way too much of one thing and not enough of the other, and then like come back out, and so you're always trying to find that happy medium. I think last year I went and taught one place other than the conference here. It was really nice, but like I miss it, right? Like I miss going out and being with the people that I teach with, because they're all awesome people and just like some of the best people on earth. And so like that's really good for me and my mental state, right? To be around good people and then to share that knowledge, which I love doing, right? Like freely and openly share it and help other people either continue the passion or find the passion or like fall back in love with the little things in the fire service. I've focused a lot on my family this last year, and like kind of I can feel like the need to want to go back out. I'm also finding like I really want to go take classes. Like it's fun to teach and stuff like that, but like I'm missing out on being a student again. And not to say like you're not a student when you're actually teaching. I learn more from people that you teach.
But actually just going to a course and being a student. Like that.
Yeah, just to shut my mind off. Like I don't have to say a word. I just have to like try what they're telling and just kind of get back to the roots of it all is always a good thing. So at some point, yeah, like I would love to go take some classes. Just got to find when I want to do it. I'm heading to Germany this year. Cody asked me if I wanted to go to Germany to help him in Brothers in Battle teach out there. So that's kind of a big one. I was like, oh boy, it's a lot of time. And so the nice thing is I get to take my wife with me. So that'll be good.
It sounds like Cody's very much about family and the fire service.
That's been the nice thing is like, I think sometimes you feel that commitment to, they've asked me to be a part of it now. Like, and like Cody's been really great about like, hey, take care of your family. We'll figure out this instructional part. Like you don't have to go to every single one of them, which has been good. How
can people get a hold of you if they want to reach out and connect?
I don't know. I gave up Facebook as you are painfully aware of trying to get a hold of me, I'm sometimes on Instagram. Yeah, that's a good one. If you want to get a hold of me, I can give you my email address. It's adam.maiers@gmail. You can send me an email and hopefully I can decipher through all the 50 billion junk mails that I get for as advertisements, but I'll try to get back to you then. But Instagram, usually just send me an Instagram message. Usually I'll get on every couple of weeks or something and just kind of scroll through. It's really funny because now that my kids are in sports, like I do a lot of research on how to help them learn their sport a little bit better and like how I can help encourage them to get better at it so they're enjoying it. So a lot of my feed ends up being that. I like get on there and I'm like, all right, like what do I need to look up for hockey so that when me and my son go out for stick and puck, we can like work on a couple of things and then go have fun. But I still check Instagram. So I try not to spend too much time on it. That's for sure.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. It's always great to sit and chat with a fellow engine nerd.
Yeah, everybody loves truck work, but I, for some reason, can't get past the engine, I guess. No, I appreciate you having me on. I'm always shocked that people get a hold of me to do a podcast because Cody always hates me saying this, but it's like, dude, I'm just another dude, right? Like, just another dude in the fire service. I've just been really fortunate in my timing to run into really good people who I think saw something in me that I might not have saw in myself and took a chance to bring me in. So
yeah, it's still good for a couple regular dudes to be able to record a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your stuff, dude. It's so fun to watch. I'm just like, oh man, you're hitting on all sorts of good stuff. So
cool, man. Thank you.
So keep it up. The impact is seen, dude.